Of all the cases that I shared with Sherlock Holmes during the years of our association, there are some that I have never spoken of publicly, and some that I have been asked about so many times that the telling has become almost mechanical. The case I am about to describe belongs to neither category. It is the one that I think about most often in the quiet hours. It is the one that Holmes himself, in a rare moment of candor, described as the most dangerous investigation of his career. And it began, as so many of our cases began, with a knock at the door before the rest of London was awake. It was early April of 1883. I had been sharing rooms with Holmes at Baker Street for some time by then, and I had grown accustomed to the irregular hours and the sudden departures and the clients who arrived at all times of day and night with problems that the official police had declined to take seriously. But I had not yet grown accustomed to being woken at 7:15 by Holmes standing at the foot of my bed, fully dressed, entirely alert, and apparently baffled by the fact that I was still asleep. He apologized with the ease of a man who did not particularly mean it, and told me that a young woman had arrived downstairs in a state of considerable distress and was asking to see him immediately. I dressed quickly and followed him down to the sitting room. The woman sitting by the fire was dressed entirely in black. Her veil was down. She rose as we entered, and even through the veil, I could see the quality of her distress before she spoke a single word. I had served as an army surgeon, and I had seen men frightened in ways that most people never encounter. This was not the fresh shock of something that had just happened. This was deeper than that. This was the particular exhaustion of someone who had been frightened for a very long time and had simply reached the point where they could no longer contain it alone. Holmes crossed to her immediately and settled her back into the chair with a quiet efficiency, and looked at her with that rapid, comprehensive attention that I had come to recognize as the beginning of his process. "You have come in by train this morning, I see," he said. The woman startled beneath her veil. "You know me?" "No," Holmes said pleasantly, "but the second half of a return ticket is visible in the palm of your left glove. You started early, and yet you had already taken a dog cart along heavy roads before you reached the station. The mud on the left arm of your jacket, 7 distinct fresh splashes, is consistent with sitting on the left side of a dog cart driver." She stared at him. I had seen that expression on clients' faces many times before. The particular bewilderment of a person who has just realized that Holmes sees things that other people do not. "There is no mystery, madam," he said. "Only observation. Now you are shivering, and the room is warm, so it is not the cold." She raised her veil. Her name, as she told us, was Helen Stoner. She was 30 years old, but her hair was already heavily streaked with gray, the premature gray that does not come from age, but from sustained and prolonged fear, and her face was drawn in a way that spoke of years rather than days. She was a woman who had been beautiful and would be again if whatever was pressing down on her were lifted. But in that chair, in that April morning, she looked like someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. "It is fear, Mr. Holmes," she said. "It is terror." Holmes leaned back and pressed his fingertips together and told her to begin at the beginning. She was the stepdaughter of Dr. Grimesby Roylott, last surviving member of one of the oldest Saxon families in England. The Roylotts of Stoke Moran had once been among the most prominent families in the country, their estate spanning 3 counties. 4 generations of gambling and reckless living had reduced that legacy to a heavily mortgaged manor house in Surrey, a few acres of overgrown land, and one man who carried the family name forward into the latter half of the 19th century. Roylott had not accepted his inheritance passively. He went to India. He earned a medical degree. He built a successful practice in Calcutta through genuine professional ability and a quality of personal determination that I found, even then, easier to respect in the abstract than to contemplate directly. For a period he was, by all available accounts, a capable and even admired physician. And then he killed a man. In a fit of rage over what he believed to be a household theft, he beat his native butler to death. He narrowly escaped a capital sentence. He did not escape prison. He served a long term and returned to England with the specific alteration that prison sometimes produces in men of strong character. Not a softening, but a hardening, a compression of everything dangerous into something denser and less predictable. In India, he had married a widow, a Mrs. Stoner, mother of twin girls aged 2 at the time of the marriage. The financial arrangement was straightforward. Mrs. Stoner's annual income, over £1,000 per year, passed to Roylott's control for as long as the girls remained under his roof. There was one provision. If either daughter married, a fixed annual sum would transfer to her from that total income. Roylott would retain the remainder. Mrs. Stoner died in a railway accident 8 years after the marriage. After that, it was Stoke Moran, the 3 of them, a decaying house, no neighbors who lasted, no friends, no servants who stayed longer than a month. I listened to Helen Stoner describe what Roylott had become in the years since his return from India, and I felt, more than once, the particular unease of a medical man hearing symptoms that point somewhere he would rather they did not. The violence of temper had always been present, she said, but after prison, it had become something else, something without a reliable ceiling. 2 altercations had ended in police court. The week before she came to Baker Street, he had thrown the local blacksmith over a parapet into a stream. She had spent the last of her available money to prevent yet another prosecution. He kept exotic animals brought from India, a cheetah and a baboon that wandered the estate grounds freely and were feared throughout the surrounding village. He maintained one social connection in the district, a band of Romani travelers who camped on the estate with his permission, and with whom he sometimes disappeared for weeks at a time. Helen and her sister had locked their bedroom doors every night. She said this as a statement of practical fact, not only because of the animals. Her sister's name was Julia. They were twins. Julia had died 2 years before the morning I am describing, in a locked room in that same house, and no one had ever been able to explain how or why. Julia had become engaged 2 years before her death. A half-pay major of Marines she had met at their aunt's house near Harrow over the Christmas holiday. Roylott had raised no objection to the match when Julia told him. The wedding was planned for the following spring. Julia was dead within a fortnight of the date being set. In the days before she died, Julia had told Helen about a sound she had been hearing in the night, a low, clear whistle, occurring consistently around 3 in the morning. She could not locate it with any certainty. She could not determine whether it came from somewhere outside on the grounds or from somewhere inside the house itself. She thought perhaps it was the Romani travelers in the nearby plantation. She mentioned it once to Helen, received no useful answer, and said nothing further about it. The night Julia died was a night of severe storm, rain driving against the windows, wind high enough to make the old house creak and shift around them. I could not sleep, Helen told us. She lay awake with a formless sense of dread that she could neither identify nor dismiss. Julia had come to her room earlier that evening, and they had sat together for a while, talking about the wedding, talking about ordinary things. At 11 o'clock, Julia rose to leave. She paused at the door. She turned back and asked Helen one more time whether she had ever heard the whistle in the night. Helen told her she had not. Julia smiled. She stepped into the corridor, closed the door, and Helen heard the key turn in the lock from the inside. 2 hours later, Helen heard her sister scream. I have heard men scream in circumstances that I will not describe in detail. I know what genuine terror sounds like when it comes out of a human throat. What Helen described was that sound, not surprise, not pain, terror. She was out of her room and into the corridor within seconds. As she opened her own door, she heard two things in rapid succession. First, a low whistle, the same sound Julia had described, and immediately after, a sharp metallic clang, heavy and abrupt, like something solid made of iron, dropping hard and fast into a fixed position. Then Julia's door opened. Julia was standing in the frame. Her face had lost all color. Both arms were extended outward at shoulder height, the hands open, reaching for something that was not there. Her entire body moved with the loose, uncontrolled sway of a person whose muscles have stopped responding reliably to conscious direction. Helen ran to her and caught her, and the moment she made contact, Julia's legs gave way completely. She went down to the floor of the corridor, and the convulsions began, rigid, then shaking, then rigid again, cycling through with a violence that Helen could do nothing to interrupt. She knelt beside her sister and held her and called her name. And for one moment, perhaps 5 seconds, Julia's eyes came into focus. She looked up at Helen, and she was present, and she said, "Oh my God, Helen, it was the band, the Speckled Band." She raised one hand and pointed toward the wall that her room shared with their stepfather's. Then the next convulsion took her. She lost consciousness. She never regained it. She was dead before the doctor arrived from the village. The coroner's investigation was thorough. Roylott was not a popular figure in the county, and there was no shortage of motivation to look carefully. The physical evidence produced nothing. The door had been locked from the inside. The window shutters were iron-barred and bolted shut from within, found completely undisturbed. The chimney was sealed at 4 points with iron staples. The walls were solid stone throughout, carefully sounded, and found intact. No poison appeared on toxicological examination. No marks of violence appeared on the body. No weapon was found. No route by which anyone could have entered or left the room could be established. The coroner recorded death from nervous shock and fright. Cause of origin unknown. 2 years passed. Helen reigned in that house. Then, a month ago, she became engaged to a man named Percy Armitage. The wedding was planned for spring. 2 days before she came to us, building repairs forced her out of her regular room, and she was moved temporarily into Julia's room. Julia's bed. On her first night there, in the small hours, she heard the whistle. She lit her lamp at once. The room was empty and undisturbed in every visible respect. She did not sleep again. She dressed before dawn, slipped out of the house before Roylott woke, and took the first available train to London. Holmes had been listening with his eyes half closed and his fingertips pressed together, and the particular quality of stillness that meant his mind was moving very fast behind a calm exterior. When Helen finished, he asked her 2 brief questions about the physical layout of the rooms, and then leaned forward. He moved aside the lace frill at her sleeve without asking permission and without explanation. On her wrist were 5 marks, 4 fingers and a thumb pressed hard into pale skin, the grip of a very large hand applied with considerable force. I looked at those marks with a doctor's eye and said nothing. Holmes set her sleeve back and said quietly that she had been cruelly used, and nothing further on the subject. He arranged for her to return home, to say nothing to her stepfather, and to expect us in Surrey that same afternoon, while Roylott was away in town. She agreed, dropped her veil, and left. I will confess that when the door closed behind her, I felt something that I can only describe as a shift in the atmosphere of the room. Holmes was already on his feet. "This is a very dark business, Watson," he said, "and I do not think we yet appreciate its full dimensions." He had barely finished speaking when we heard the street door open below and heavy footsteps on the stairs, and then our sitting room door was thrown open with a force that sent it crashing against the wall. The man in the doorway was one of the most physically formidable human beings I have ever encountered, and I say that as someone who has spent time in the company of soldiers. He was tall enough that his hat grazed the top of the door frame. His shoulders nearly filled the width of the entrance. But size alone does not account for what I felt in that moment, which was something closer to the instinctive response one has in the presence of a large and unpredictable animal. His face had been burnt yellow-brown by decades in India and was deeply lined with the specific weathering of sustained anger. His eyes were deep-set and carried a yellowish tint that told me, as a doctor, something about the condition of his liver. His nose was thin and sharp. His mouth was a compressed hard line. He wore a black top hat, a long frock coat, and high gaiters. He carried a riding crop and swung it with a slow, deliberate casualness that I found more unsettling than if he had raised it. He identified himself as Dr. Grimsby Roylott of Stoke Moran. He had traced his stepdaughter to Baker Street. He told Holmes what he thought of private detectives in terms that were direct and unflattering. Holmes listened with an expression of mild interest and suggested he close the door on his way out, as there was a draught. Roylott crossed to the fireplace. He picked up the steel poker, a solid iron instrument of considerable weight. Without apparent effort, without looking away from Holmes, he bent it into a curve with his bare hands. He set it back down, held Holmes's gaze for a moment, and walked out. The door closed behind him with a controlled force that was somehow more deliberate and more threatening than the slam would have been. Holmes picked up the bent poker and, using both hands and the edge of the fireplace for leverage, worked it back toward its original shape. "He's a dangerous man," he said, "and I confess that I am not entirely certain we appreciate yet the full scope of what that means in practical terms." He set the poker down. "But he has done us a service this morning, Watson. A man who comes to Baker Street for the sole purpose of frightening a private detective is a man who is afraid of what that detective is going to find." He reached for his coat. "I am going to Doctor's Commons this morning," he said. "I want the precise financial terms of Mrs. Stoner's will, every figure. Then we go to Surrey. Bring your revolver." He returned just before 1 o'clock with a sheet of blue paper covered in numbers. He spread it on the table. The original estate income had exceeded £1,000 annually. Each daughter who married would receive £250 of that figure per year. Roylott retained the rest. But the underlying investments had not performed well over the years, and the actual current income was substantially reduced from the original estimate. If both daughters married, what remained for Roylott would barely sustain the estate at its most minimal level. One daughter marrying damaged him seriously. 2 daughters marrying would come very close to ruining him. Julia had been engaged, Holmes said. She was dead within a fortnight of the announcement. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket. "Helen is now engaged," he said, "and she has heard the whistle." He looked at me steadily across the table. "We are going to Stoke Moran this afternoon, Watson," he said, "and I want to be inside that room before tonight, because I do not think we have the luxury of waiting." I put on my coat. I checked my revolver, and we left for Surrey. What Holmes found in that room that evening would answer a question that had been sitting unanswered for 2 years. How does something kill a woman in a sealed room without leaving a mark, without leaving a trace, without leaving a single piece of physical evidence that any investigator could identify or explain? And what was Julia Stoner trying to name with the last coherent words she ever spoke? The answer had been in that room since the night she died, and it was more deliberate and more cold-blooded than anything I had allowed myself to imagine on the train down to Surrey. We took the train from Waterloo that afternoon, Holmes and I will confess that I spent most of the journey watching him rather than the countryside passing outside the window. He had bought a map of the county at the station and spent the first half hour studying it with the focused attention he gave to everything he considered relevant. Then he folded, put it away, and sat with his eyes half closed and his fingers pressed together and said nothing at all for the remainder of the journey. I knew better than to interrupt him in that state. When Holmes went quiet in that particular way, it meant that something was assembling itself in his mind that was not yet ready to be spoken aloud. We arrived at Leatherhead and hired a trap from the station inn, an open vehicle drawn by a fast horse that took us along narrow country lanes through Surrey countryside. It was a fine day, cold and clear, with a sharp wind coming across the open fields. Under other circumstances, I might have enjoyed the drive. As it was, I found myself thinking about a woman dying on the floor of a corridor with a hand pointing at a wall, and I did not enjoy it much. Stoke Moran came into view gradually, the way old houses in the English countryside tend to, through gaps in the hedgerows and between the branches of trees that had been growing there for longer than anyone currently alive could remember. It was a heavy grey building of considerable age, with high chimneys, a facade that had once been impressive and was now simply large and decaying. Two wings extended from the central block, one of which was in obvious disrepair, its roof partially collapsed, its windows dark and empty. The other wing appeared inhabited. The grounds around it had been allowed to grow more or less as they chose. I was looking at the house when Holmes touched my arm and directed my attention to a figure standing in the lane ahead of us. It was a woman, and I recognized her even at that distance as Helen Stoner. She had clearly been watching for us. She came forward quickly as the trap slowed. "I have been waiting so anxiously," she said. "Everything has worked out splendidly. Dr. Roylott has gone into town and is not likely to be back before evening." Holmes stepped down from the trap and looked at the house with those sharp eyes moving quickly across the facade and the grounds. "We must make the best use of our time," he said. "Take us to the rooms at once." Helen led us through the main entrance and along a low corridor to the wing that was still in use. There were 3 rooms in sequence along the corridor. The first was Helen's, into which she had been moved temporarily while repairs were made. The middle room had been Julia's. The third, at the far end, was Dr. Roylott's. Holmes examined Helen's room first, and I stood in the doorway and watched him work. It was a process I had witnessed many times, and it never entirely lost its quality of strangeness. He moved through the room with a kind of compressed intensity, his lens appearing and disappearing from his hand, his eyes covering the floor, the walls, the ceiling, the furniture, in a sequence that appeared random but clearly was not. He tapped the walls at intervals and listened. He examined the floor on his hands and knees. He looked at the window, the shutters, the bolts. He examined the bed, the bedding, the furniture against each wall. Then he crossed to the ventilator. It was set high in the wall, near the ceiling, in the wall shared with the middle room. Holmes looked at it for a long moment. He stood on a chair and looked at it more closely. He put his hand over it and felt for air movement. He stepped down from the chair, and I could see from his face that something had registered, though he said nothing yet. He examined the bell rope next. It hung beside the bed, a thick braided cord that descended from a hook near the ceiling to a position within easy reach of someone lying down. I assumed it connected to a bell in the servants' quarters below. Holmes took it in his hand and gave it a pull. "It is a dummy," he said. I looked at him. It does not connect to anything, he said. It hangs from a hook screwed into a hole in the wall directly above the ventilator. It serves no purpose that I can identify except to hang there and appear functional. This rope has never hung a bell. It was installed for some other reason entirely. He looked at the bed. I should like you to notice something, Watson, he said. Look at the bed. Look at where it stands in relation to the floor. I looked. The bed was a heavy wooden frame with thick mattress. It was positioned against the wall in the ordinary way, but when I looked more carefully, I noticed something that I had not noticed at first glance. The feet of the bed were fixed to the floor, not by accident, not by weight, by clamps, iron clamps secured into the floorboards. The bed could not be moved. It is clamped down, I said. Holmes nodded. It has been there since before the current bedding was put on it, and it cannot be moved. A person sleeping in this bed sleeps in a fixed position relative to the bell rope and the ventilator above. They cannot move the bed closer to the window or further from the wall. They sleep exactly where the bed dictates. He stepped back and looked at the room as a whole, and I could see him assembling something, fitting pieces together in his mind with a precision that I could follow only imperfectly from the outside. Then he said, "Let us look at Dr. Roylott's room." Helen unlocked the door at the end of the corridor, and we went in. It was a large room, cleaner than I had expected, given the scale of the house. A camp bed in one corner, a wooden chair, a large iron safe against one wall, the kind used for securing valuables, a wooden shelf with a row of medical books, a saucer of milk on the floor near the safe, and in another corner, a small dog leash, the loop end coiled on the floor, with a peculiar knot at the end of the lead that I did not immediately recognize. Holmes crossed to the safe immediately. He examined it carefully, running his hands across the surface, checking the door and the hinges and the ventilation holes near the base. "What do you make of this, Watson?" he said. "A large iron safe, a saucer of milk beside it." I said that I supposed he kept business documents in it, or money. Holmes nodded slowly, looking at the safe with an expression I had learned to read as meaning that what he was seeing and what he was thinking about it were two different things. He picked up the dog leash from the corner and examined it. He looked at the knot at the end for a long time. He set it down. He crossed to the ventilator in the wall of this room, which connected to the same opening as the one we had seen in the middle room. He looked at it, and then looked back at the safe, and then looked at the saucer of milk. Then he straightened up, and I saw something settle in his face. The quality of a man who has put the last piece of something into place. He said nothing. He crossed back to the middle room, and I followed him. He stood in the center of the room and looked at the bell rope and the ventilator and the clamped bed and the window, and then he turned to Helen, who had been standing quietly in the doorway, watching him. "Miss Stoner," he said, "I believe I know what happened to your sister, and I believe I know what has been intended for you. I need you to do exactly as I tell you tonight, without question and without hesitation." Helen said she would do whatever he asked. Holmes told her to go back to her room, to send word to her stepfather when he returned that she was unwell and would be spending the night in her own room, and to take a lamp and move herself into the room at the other end of the corridor the moment she was certain Roylott had retired. She was to leave the middle room available, and she was to leave the window of that room unlatched. He and I would be waiting outside in the grounds after dark and would enter through the window. She was not to be alarmed by anything she might hear in the night. Whatever sounds came from the middle room, she was to stay where she was. She listened to all of this with a steadiness that I found remarkable, given everything she was living with, and agreed without question. We left Stoke Moran before Roylott returned, and drove back to Leatherhead, and took dinner at the inn there. Holmes ate well and spoke of other things, of county history and botany, and one or two criminal cases from the previous decade that had caught his interest, and said not one word about what he had seen in those rooms or what he expected to happen that night. I had known him long enough not to press him. He would tell me what I needed to know when he judged I needed to know it. At 11 o'clock, we left the inn and made our way back across the dark Surrey countryside towards Stoke Moran. The night was clear and cold, the stars sharp overhead, the fields on either side of the lane very still and very quiet. Somewhere on the grounds of the estate, I was aware, a cheetah and a baboon were moving freely. I kept my hand near my coat pocket, where the revolver was. Holmes found the unlatched window of the middle room, and we climbed through in silence. Inside, the room was dark. Holmes had a small lamp with him that he shuttered so that only a thin thread of light was available. He directed briefly around the room and then put it down on the floor. "Now, we wait," he said very quietly. "And Watson, I must ask you not to fall asleep. Whatever you hear tonight, whatever you see, do not move until I tell you to move, and keep your revolver within reach." I sat in the chair Holmes indicated, which was positioned against the wall nearest the door. Holmes sat on the edge of the clamped bed, directly below the bell rope and the ventilator. He did not lean back. He sat forward, elbows on his knees, his face turned upward toward the ventilator and the wall above him. His cane was across his knees. His face in the dim light was absolutely still. We waited. An hour passed, then another. The house was quiet around us in the way that old houses are quiet at night, full of small sounds that are not threatening individually but accumulate into a kind of ambient unease. I heard the wind outside. I heard the old timbers settling. I heard, once, somewhere in the grounds, a sound that I could not immediately identify and then recognized as the low call of the baboon, and I felt the short hairs on my neck respond before my conscious mind could reassure them. Then, at around 3 in the morning, I heard something else. A low hissing sound, very soft, coming from the ventilator. Holmes came off the bed in a single movement. In the same instant, he struck a match and lit the lamp, and raised his cane and brought it down hard against the bell rope, again and again, striking with a controlled violence and a speed that startled me even though I was watching for something to happen. And then, from the other side of the ventilator, from Dr. Roylott's room, came a sound that I have never in my life forgotten and never expect to forget. It was a horrible cry, not a shout, not a scream exactly, something between the two, with a quality of shock and agony that was entirely unlike any human sound I had heard before. I had heard a considerable number. Then silence. Holmes was already moving toward the door. His face in the lamplight was very pale. "It is over, Watson," he said. "Come." We went along the corridor quickly, Holmes ahead of me with the lamp, and stopped at the door of Dr. Roylott's room. Holmes knocked once. There was no answer. He tried the handle and the door opened. Roylott was sitting in the wooden chair in the center of the room. He was not moving. He was dressed in his long gray dressing gown, and his eyes were fixed on the ceiling with an expression that I recognized before I had consciously formed the thought. The wide, rigid stare of a man who has died in the grip of extreme shock and terror. On his head, coiled with a neatness that would have seemed almost decorative under any other circumstances, was a peculiar yellow band with brownish speckles, looped twice around his brow and raised at one end into an upright posture. I had taken one step into the room when Holmes seized my arm. "Do not go closer," he said quietly. "Not yet." He stood in the doorway and looked at Roylott, with those sharp eyes moving carefully across the scene, without touching anything. Then he crossed the room in 2 long strides and seized the dog leash from the corner, and in a single practiced motion looped it around the thing on Roylott's head, and carried it at arm's length across the room and dropped it into the iron safe and closed the door and turned the key. Then he let out a long, slow breath and turned to face me. "It is a swamp adder," he said. "The deadliest snake in India. He had it in the safe. He trained it. He sent it through the ventilator when he chose, and it came along the cord of the dummy bell rope and descended onto whoever was sleeping in the bed below. The milk in the saucer was how he called it back. The whistle was how he summoned it. And the metallic clang that Helen heard the night Julia died was the door of the safe being shut again after he had retrieved it." I stood in the doorway of that room and looked at Roylott in his chair, and at the closed safe, and at Holmes standing beside it, and I felt the particular feeling that comes when something very terrible resolves itself into sense. Not relief exactly, something more complicated than relief. I crossed to Roylott and examined him. It did not take long. There were 2 small puncture marks on his right hand, close together, the skin around them already beginning to show the characteristic discoloration. His pulse was absent. His pupils were fixed and dilated. The venom of a swamp adder acts with extraordinary speed on the human nervous system, and Roylott had been an old man with a compromised constitution. He had been dead, I estimated, for less than 10 minutes. "He died within seconds of being struck," I said. Holmes nodded. He had been using that cane of his to strike at the snake as it came through the ventilator, trying to drive it back. The snake, disturbed and threatened, had turned on the nearest living thing, which was the man who had trained it and had been directing it for 2 years. He looked at the closed safe. "It is, I suppose, a fitting outcome for a man who constructed such a mechanism. He was hoisted by his own petard, Watson, and I cannot find it in myself to feel a great deal of remorse about that." I could not find it in myself either, though I did not say so immediately. I had looked at the marks on Helen Stoner's wrist that morning, and I had thought of Julia dying on the floor of a corridor at 30 years old, pointing at a wall, and I found that my capacity for professional detachment had certain limits. "We need to secure the room," Holmes said, "and we need to speak to Miss Stoner before she hears this from anyone else." We locked the door of Roylott's room, and Holmes kept the key. Helen was still awake, and came to her door immediately when Holmes knocked softly. She looked at his face and then at mine, and I watched her read the answer in both before either of us spoke. Holmes told her simply and directly. He told her that her stepfather was dead, and that she was in no further danger, and that she should try, if she could, to sleep. He told her that he would remain in the house until morning, and that nothing further would harm her tonight. "Sir." She listened to all of it with the same remarkable steadiness she had shown throughout, and then sat down on the edge of her bed and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Julia." Holmes said nothing. There was nothing to say. Helen looked up at him. She asked him how. Not how Roylott had died. How Julia had died. She wanted to know what it had been. She had been living with that question for 2 years, and she wanted the answer. Holmes told her all of it. The snake, the safe, the ventilator, the dummy bell rope, the clamped bed. He explained it in the same quiet, precise way he explained everything, without softening it and without elaborating beyond what the facts required. Julia had been sleeping in a bed positioned directly below the ventilator. The snake had come through the opening in the wall and descended the rope and struck her in the dark. She had not seen it. She had felt it. And in the seconds before the venom overcame her, she had got to the door and opened it and tried to tell her sister what had happened. And the words that had come out were the closest she could get to a description of what she had seen or felt in the darkness of that room. "The speckled band," Helen said. "The snake," Holmes said. "Yellow, with brown markings. In the dark, in the moment of shock. That is what she saw. That is what she tried to name." Helen was quiet for a long time after that. I sat with her while Holmes stood at the window and looked out at the dark grounds, and after a while her breathing steadied, and the quality of her stillness changed from shock into something closer to exhaustion, and I judged that the worst of it had passed for that night at least. At first light, Holmes woke me from the chair where I had dozed for an hour, and walked to the nearest village and sent word to the local police and to Helen's fiance. And by mid-morning, the official machinery had arrived and taken over the proceedings in the way that official machineries do. On the train back to London, Holmes leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes and said nothing for a long time. I watched the Surrey countryside give way to the outer edges of the city and thought about the case in the way I often did on the journey home, trying to trace the line from the beginning to the end and understand how Holmes had traveled it so much faster than anyone else. I asked him when he had known, not suspected, known. He opened his eyes. When I saw the ventilator, he said. A ventilator that connects two adjoining rooms but opens too high in the wall to provide any practical air circulation serves no ventilation purpose. It serves some other purpose. And when I saw the dummy bell rope hanging directly below it, and the bed clamped to the floor in a fixed position below the rope, I had three connected objects that made no individual sense, but made very clear collective sense. Something came through the ventilator. Something descended the rope. Something reached whatever was lying in the bed. The only question was what? And the safe? I said. And the milk? He nodded. A large iron safe in a bedroom. Not for documents, Watson. Not for money. Those go in a study or a bank. A safe in a bedroom is for something living. Something that needs to be contained but also needs air. Which is why the ventilation holes were at the base rather than the top. The saucer of milk confirmed it. He trained the snake to return to the safe when he whistled and rewarded it with milk. A simple conditioning mechanism, crude but effective. I thought about that for a moment, about the patience it would have required to construct such a method, to install the ventilator, the rope, the clamped bed, to train the snake, to wait, to do it once to Julia, and then to wait 2 more years for the opportunity with Helen. He is the worst man I have encountered in a career that has brought me into contact with some very bad men, Holmes said, as if he had followed my thought. Because he was intelligent. Unintelligent men do terrible things impulsively and are caught quickly. Roylott planned this with the care of a surgeon and the patience of a man who understood that time was on his side. If Helen had not come to me when she did, she would have been dead within the month. He closed his eyes again. We were quiet for the rest of the journey. I have recorded this case in more detail than I have recorded many others, because I believe it illustrates something important about the nature of the work Holmes did, something that I was not always able to articulate clearly in the earlier years of our association, but that I understood better as time went on. The most dangerous crimes are not the ones that are violent and visible. They are the ones that are patient and invisible. The ones that hide behind locked doors and sealed windows and the assumption that what cannot be explained cannot be solved. Roylott had constructed something that he believed was perfect. No entry, no exit, no poison, no weapon, no marks, nothing that any investigator following ordinary channels of inquiry could ever reach. What he had not accounted for was a man who did not follow ordinary channels of inquiry. A man who looked at a dummy bell rope and a ventilator and a clamped bed and read them not as separate unremarkable objects, but as a single connected sentence written in the language of criminal intention. Julia Stoner died because no one could read that sentence in time. Helen Stoner lived because Holmes could. I have thought about that many times in the years since, in quiet moments and in difficult ones, and I have never found a way to improve on it as a summary of what Sherlock Holmes was and what he did. He read what other people could not read, and in the reading, sometimes, he saved lives. This was one of those times, and I was glad, as I always was, to have been there.